This is something I see constantly in gacha communities. Whenever a story reaches a breaking point, someone inevitably says this: they should have killed a playable character. Because for a lot of people, character death has become shorthand for good writing. More mature, more serious, higher stakes. And when that doesn't happen, the conversation usually shifts to complaints about fake out deaths and accusations of cowardly storytelling. I've always found that reaction a bit misplaced. Now, I'll be upfront about one thing. I'm not a big fan of tragedy. I don't actively want to see playable characters die, and that definitely shapes how I experience these stories. But that's just preference, and preference alone doesn't tell us whatever something actually works. So for this video, I want to set taste aside. Instead of asking whatever character death is good or bad, I want to ask a more practical question. What does killing a playable character actually do in a gacha story? Does it really create stakes? Are fake out deaths automatically bad writing? Then what are the trade-offs when a game commits to permanent death or deliberately avoids it? Because gacha stories don't function like novels or TV shows. And when we judge them by those standards, we often end up with conclusions that feel satisfying on paper but don't actually make sense in practice. So let's talk about death in gacha games, not as shock value, but as a narrative tool, and whatever it really does what people expect it to do. Before we talk about whatever playable characters death actually work, it's worth asking a simpler question first. Why do people want this at all? And honestly, the answer isn't complicated. Most of the time it comes down to stakes. In a lot of long-running gacha stories, players eventually start feeling like nothing truly irreversible can happen. The threats are always massive, the world is always on the brink. But the core cast keeps moving forward more or less intact. And after a while that creates a disconnect. If the danger is real, then something important should be lost, so people start looking for consequences that actually stick, and playable characters feel like the most obvious answer. There's also the common belief in storytelling discussions that killing a character automatically makes the story more mature, more realistic, and more emotionally impactful. And to be fair, in some kind of stories that can be true. That is final, it's irreversible, it's one of the strongest tools a writer has. So when a gacha story starts feeling too safe or too comfortable, that begins to feel like the missing ingredient. Not because players necessarily want tragedy, but because they want proof the story is willing to commit to its consequences. Playable characters matter more than NPCs. They're the ones you spend time with, the ones you invest resources into, the ones you pull for and build teams around. So when an NPC dies, it might serve the plot, but it rarely feels personal. A playable character that, on the other hand, would feel personal. It feels like it would matter. It feels like a line the story can walk back from. The problem is that this line of thinking often skips a step. It assumes that death automatically equals meaningful consequences, and that isn't always true. A character dying doesn't guarantee long-term narrative change, it doesn't guarantee emotional follow-through, and it doesn't guarantee deeper storytelling. It only guarantees absence, which can be powerful, but can also be hollow, depending on how the story is actually built around it. And that's where this conversation usually starts to break down. If we're talking about death as a narrative tool, there's something that needs to be said clearly up front. Death is powerful. In almost any story, killing an important character raises stakes immediately. It creates emotional weight, it signals commitment. None of that stops being true just because we're talking about gacha games. So yes, on paper, the death of playable characters could do all of these things. The problem isn't the moment of death, it's everything that comes after. Death is one of the strongest tools a writer has, and because of that, it demands full commitment. You can use it casually, you can use it evenly, and you definitely can use it on just any character. Even in gacha stories, not all playable characters are emotionally equal. Some clearly matter more, they carry more narrative weight, they're more central to the story, and more deeply invested in by the player. If death is used on a character who doesn't sit at the top tier of importance, it doesn't feel bold, it feels cheap. So right away, the number of characters you can meaningfully kill is already very small. One argument I've seen come up a lot is this, that killing a playable character once creates ongoing tension, because now players believe it could happen again, and I understand that logic. But personally, I think that's a misuse of death as a tool. Death shouldn't exist just to threaten the audience, it shouldn't be used as a warning sign. That kind of tension isn't earned, it's borrowed. And once that becomes something the story uses to keep player on the edge, instead of something that reshapes the narrative, it loses the weight that made it meaningful in the first place. Let's say a gacha story does commit. Let's say it kills one of its most important playable characters. In the moment, it works. It's heavy, it's shocking, it leaves an impact. But then the structure of gacha storytelling takes over, because gacha stories don't stop. They don't narrow their focus for long, and they don't linger forever. They move on. The narrative shifts to the next arc, the next banner, the next character, and emotionally, players follow, not because they don't care, but because the format encourages it. That isn't just about impact, it's about lingering. In stories where that truly works, it continues to shape how characters behave, how relationships evolve, how the world feels. Not for one chapter, not for one arc, but for the rest of the story. Because gacha narratives are designed to run for years, they're built around rotation, expansion, and renewal. You can't realistically ask a story like that to carry the full emotional weight of a single death across its entire lifespan. And if that doesn't continue to shape the story long term, then it loses the very thing that made it powerful. It becomes a moment, not a foundation. And this is what I think the conversation often goes wrong. That is one way to create stakes, but it's not the only way, and it's not always the best one for this medium. There are plenty of other tools that gacha stories can sustain more effectively. Irreversible changes to the world, permanent losses that don't involve death, shifts in power, identity, or relationships, consequences that limit future choices. If a story can fully commit to death, then it's often better to use those tools instead, rather than reaching for the heaviest option and only using half of it. So when people say that killing playable characters would automatically improve gacha stories, I don't really agree. Not because that can't work, but because gacha storytelling by design struggles to sustain what death actually demands. At least when it comes to playable characters, because when we shift the focus to NPCs, this becomes a very different conversation. Some of the most impactful deaths I've seen in gacha storytelling don't involve playable characters at all. And that's not a coincidence. NPCs' deaths work under a different set of rules. They aren't tied to banners, they don't need to remain usable, and they don't need to rotate back into relevance every few months. Which means the story can afford to let their absence matter. And when a gacha story handles that well, this is usually where it happens. One of the strongest examples of this, for me, is Pina from Nikke. Her death is undeniably tragic, it's written carefully and it's emotionally effective. But what's important is what doesn't happen afterwards. Pina's death doesn't reshape the world itself, the story doesn't constantly circle back to it, the narrative doesn't stop to remind you how sad it was. Instead, her death becomes something far more powerful. It becomes Dorothy's trauma. And that matters because Dorothy isn't just any character, she's deeply tied to the main narrative, she's influential, and her actions, both present and future, are shaped by that loss. Even long after Pina is gone, whenever Dorothy appears on screen, you can still feel it. That's lingering consequences. Pina's death doesn't need repetition to stay relevant, it lives on throughout the character who continues to shape the story. That's how death works when it's used properly. A second example that really drives this home is Mia from Wuthering Wave. Unlike Pina, Mia's death doesn't primarily shape a single character, it reshapes the entire situation. And what makes her story so powerful is that she was never meant to be extraordinary in the first place. Mia was a gladiator, she was mistreated by the people of Septimod, used as a distraction by the Senate to redirect public anger, and exploited by those who managed her. And yet despite all of that, she never turned her hatred outward. Even when Leviathan, a Trinodian capable of overwhelming even the strongest individuals in the world, began manipulating her mind and attempting to take control of her body, she resisted, not because she was the strongest person alive, not because she was chosen, but because she refused to let herself become a weapon. In the end, Mia makes a choice that very few characters in gacha stories ever do. She stabs herself to resist Leviathan's control, and throws herself into the ocean surrounding Septimod, ending her own life to prevent a catastrophe. Her body is lost to the sea, and throughout that sacrifice, she holds back a world-ending threat long enough for the protagonist to arrive and finish what she began. That's what makes her death so meaningful, not the tragedy, not the spectacle, but the fact that a normal person, someone without special identity, without narrative protection, was able to stand against something only a handful of people in the world are even capable of fighting. Her death tells the audience something important, that willpower matters, that resistance matters, that even in a world of overwhelming forces, choices still carries weight. And that's why Mia's death works so well, because the story doesn't just move past it, it's built on what she held back and what she gave up to make the rest of the narrative possible. And this is the key difference. When death is written like this, when it changes the world, shapes the narrative, and lingers, people don't argue about whatever it counts. they feel it. The controversy only starts when people expect death to be doing something the story never actually promised it would do. Because a lot of what gets labeled as a fake out death isn't a failed execution of death at all. It's a mismatch between audience expectations and narrative intent. In other words, people aren't reacting to bad writing as much as they're reacting to the story refusing to use death the way they wanted to. And that's why I don't really like the term fake out death. Because in most cases where it gets thrown around, the story was never trying to kill the character in the first place. So before we talked about when fake out deaths actually are bad, we need to talk about what people are missing when they see a character die on screen and immediately assume the story is lying to them. A fake out death implies intent. It implies that the writer wanted the audience to believe a character was dead, presented the moment as final, and then later walked it back for shock or convenience. That's bad writing. I don't disagree with that at all. But if a story never presents a moment as final, if it leaves clear ambiguity, then calling it a fake out isn't accurate. It's just disagreement with the writer's choice. So I want to talk about how to tell if a death was never meant to be final. There are a few basic things I always look for. None of these are absolute rules, but taken together they're usually very reliable. First, do we see the body? This is one of the oldest storytelling conventions for a reason. If a body is not shown, the story is usually signaling unresolved status. That doesn't mean survival is guaranteed, but it does mean finality was never confirmed. Second, what is gained or lost through this death? That isn't just removal, it's narrative transfer. Something must change for the killer, for the character who dies, or for a third party. If no one gains insight, no one loses something meaningful, and the world remains structurally the same, then the event isn't functioning as death, it's functioning as transition. Third, what does death even mean in this setting? This is especially important in fantasy and science fiction. If characters aren't purely physical, can be reconstructed, exist as data, energy, or frequencies, then death isn't a simply binary state. You can't apply real-world expectations to worlds that don't follow real-world rules. And for this I want to use Prolova's situation as a case study, because when her situation came around, a lot of people called that a fake out death and were really angry because of it. But I don't agree with calling her situation a fake out death. Let's look at the signals. We never see a body. She falls into an abyss, one of the most classic not confirmed outcomes in fiction. No clear narrative transfer occurs. The protagonist doesn't gain closure. The world doesn't meaningfully change, no one processes loss as final, and most importantly, the setting itself undermines the idea of simple death. Characters in Wuthering Waves are composed of frequencies, identity isn't purely physical, and Frolova specifically is established as someone deeply capable of manipulating those frequencies. Assuming that a single strike equals permanent death in that context ignores the rules the story has already established. Nothing about that scene was framed as final, it was framed as unresolved. So why do people keep calling moments like these fake out deaths? Because it's a convenient label. It's an easy way to express I want this to be a death and it wasn't. But that doesn't make it bad writing, it just means that the writer and the audience weren't aiming for the same outcome. And that's subjective disagreement, not a structural failure. When we label unresolved moments as fake outs, we blur an important distinction. We stop talking about narrative intent, world rules, and structural consistencies, and instead we reduce everything to whatever a story did what we personally wanted it to do. That doesn't help critique, it just flattens it. Now let's talk about when fake out deaths are actually bad writing. So far I've been arguing that a lot of so-called fake out deaths aren't really fake out deaths at all. But that doesn't mean bad fake out deaths don't exist, they absolutely do. And one of the worst examples I have ever seen didn't come from a gacha game, it came from a Chinese web novel called Against the Gods. This was one of the first Chinese web novels I ever read, and at the time I genuinely liked it. I made it over 1,000 chapters in, but eventually I had to stop, and the reason was repeated fake out deaths. In Against the Gods, the fake out death happens to the protagonist, not at the end of the story, not at a natural breaking point, but right in the middle. And that already undermines the entire premise. The reader knows the protagonist can't be dead, so there's no emotional tension to begin with. But it gets worse. The purpose of these fake out deaths isn't character development, it isn't emotional consequences, it's structural reset. Whenever the protagonist becomes too capable, whenever the story starts feeling too stable, the author removes him from the board. The world believes he's dead, everything falls apart again, the stakes are artificially reset, and then later he comes back. This is a death being used as a tool, not for the reader, but for the author. It's not about consequences, it's not about loss, it's not about meaning. It's about convenience, and because it works once, the story does it again and again, and by the third or fourth time, any remaining emotional weight is completely gone. Death stops meaning anything at all, and at that point it's not tragic, it's not shocking, it's just mechanical. This is what a fake-out death actually looks like. A moment framed as death, presented as final, used to manipulate the audience and then reversed purely to keep the story going. No lingering consequences, no lasting change, just repetition. And unsurprisingly, that's what finally broke my engagement with the story. Not because I dislike tragedy, but because the story trained me to stop taking its stakes seriously. This is the distinction I've been trying to draw the entire time. Not all unresolved deaths are fake-outs, but fake-outs like this absolutely deserve criticism. Because once death becomes a reset button instead of a consequence, the story loses the very thing people were asking death to provide in the first place. So after looking at all of this, I think the takeaway is pretty simple. Death isn't inherently good storytelling, and avoiding death isn't inherently bad storytelling. What actually matters is whatever the story understands what death demands, and whatever the medium it's working in can realistically support that weight. In gacha games, playable characters' death can work, but only in very narrow circumstances and only with full commitment. Once death stops shaping the story long term, once it stops lingering, once it becomes something the narrative moves past instead of something it carries forward, it loses the very power people want it for. At that point, it's no longer about stakes, it's just spectacle. And when that is used as a shortcut to signal seriousness, to threaten the audience or to reset the story, it doesn't deepen the narrative, it weakens it. That's why I don't think the real question is, why don't gacha games kill playable characters? The better question is, what kind of consequences does this format actually handles well? Because that is only one tool, and it's not always the right one. At the end of the day, this isn't an argument against tragedy or against emotional storytelling, it's an argument for intentional storytelling. For using the tools that fits the structure instead of reaching for the heaviest option and only using half of it. If you made it this far, thanks for listening, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this kind of analysis, feel free to like the video or subscribe if you want to see more discussions like this. And if you disagree, that's fine too, just keep it thoughtful. I'll see you in the next one.